So a while back, I made a video on 10 essential tips and tricks for vanilla settlement building, which consisted of techniques that make building easier, but for this video I'm mainly going to discuss my own personal design philosophy, as in I'm going to grossly over-explain my settlement building approach because I think knowing how to build is the easy part. It's kind of understanding what and why you build that can be kind of tricky, but hopefully this video can give you some creative ideas and concepts to work with for your own approach to settlements. And as a quick disclaimer, I build in vanilla with no mods, so if you really just want to learn or recap on certain building techniques, just check out part 1, but I hope you enjoyed the video and subscribe if you want to see more building content. The term lore-friendly in the context of settlement building pretty much boils down to making a settlement look like a location that fits the overall art direction, which is typically this DIY junkyard scrappy style that fits Fallout's Wasteland. Many beginners often spam the same repetitive objects, but if we just break up the mundane textures and add some variety, then we end up with some designs that I think fits the environment more and looks more natural. To recap from the first video, Group Select is a great tool to not only position objects, but also change the collision meshes, which allows you to place things that normally wouldn't be possible. In case you forgot or didn't know, we activate Group Select by holding down the Place button in Workshop mode, using a syncable object such as stairs or a pillar as the steering tool for Group Select. The concept of Wastelanders building with what they have lying around is my favorite style of visual design, but it could be seen as more of a preference thing, so the more practical reason why I use texture variety and the scrappy aesthetic as a whole is because using varied textures and designs help break up the mundane samey feeling that comes with having an extremely limited set of workshop items. I don't know about you, but seeing the same repeating texture and shapes and builds bothers me way more than it really should, and you know, for how easy it is to spam out concrete and barn buildings, I, rather take more time and effort creating a project that holds my attention for much longer. Obviously the vast majority of players are more practical with settlement building, but I personally treat it as a form of self-expression, so I like taking my time on building. In contrast with the typical Wasteland aesthetic, there's a large percentage of players who prefer squeaky clean builds, and I 100% understand that sentiment. I think there's an appeal to, not making big piles of garbage, but at the same time, I'm not really a fan of over-sanitized builds since they end up looking completely stale and boring because they're stripped of any environmental character and, replaced with like this dentist office core, like gentrified Wasteland. Obviously, there's plenty of scenarios where a clean build is needed, but there's something about completely sanitized builds that don't match the environment that completely loses my interest, Not exactly a fan of the term immersive, but that's what it really boils down to. And at the end of the day, I think settlement builds look so much better when they actually match the environment they're in. I think having a specific theme or role for a location helps reduce the mental fog you might have for deciding what to build. Introducing the entirely made up orange squeezy concept of adaptive architecture, which that basically means is building with the location in mind. So let me give you some of my own builds as examples. At Nuka World Red Rocket, the terrain is flat, dry, and barren with like a red-brown tint, so I converted it to a old western style town with the singular wide street and the false front style buildings. At Hangman's Alley, it's cramped and urban, so instead of traditional buildings, I went with a condensed metallic like techno street theme, concrete jungle if you will. The National Park Visitor Center in Far Harbor is rather isolated and forested, so I made a rugged outpost style town to reflect that. The point is, certain locations lend themselves easier for certain architectural styles and building materials. I would definitely be bored if I chose to build the exact same duplicate style for every single settlement over and over again. And if you just went out of your way to, challenge yourself and experiment with different styles, then I truly think you have a better experience building. Besides switching up your style based on the geography of the location, you can outline the specific role you might have for a settlement, and that can really help you get started with building. We can designate certain settlements such as outposts and military checkpoints, dedicated solely for food production, residential towns and safe houses, production centers such as power plants or ammo factories, commercial centered spots such as caravan hubs or marketplaces, and specific entertainment centers like casinos or battle arenas. The concept of building up a network of settlements where each piece is centralized on specific unique contributions to the overall system is such a cool concept in my opinion. So when you focus on a specific theme or role for a location, you have more focus since, you're working with the general outline and goal in mind. It helps with repetitiveness since your building experience will vary as you experiment with different concepts and environments. And it makes the building experience more memorable since every location can bring on different challenges and styles to work with. So I'll introduce a little challenge prompt to you. Sunshine Tidings is a mid-sized remote location with small pre-built cabins. We can build a simple commune style getaway build where each cabin is dedicated to specific companions. And so you'll decorate and build up the cabins based on how you personally think they would furnish their space. I think it's a simple but fun challenge that will encourage you to think about item decorations, furniture placement, and most importantly theming, really getting into the zone of environmental storytelling. As a bonus tip for you, you'll run into the issue of these reoccurring corpses that keep spawning, and so a solution that worked for me is to drag them out of Sunshine's loading zone, then loot everything that they have, blow up the pieces with explosive weapons, cannibalize them, and wait exactly 7 in-game days inside. And some combination of that prevented the corpses from spawning, at least for me. This tip is specifically about building structures that you create yourself in workshop mode. And the best advice I could give you with making interesting buildings is to look at real-world architecture and take some inspiration from them. Part of what I think makes them visually interesting are that roofs can completely change the visual silhouette of the building. So instead of sticking with the same generic corporate cube, you can break up the entire box silhouette that you typically see in vanilla builds. The broader idea is that you can really experiment with the actual shape and size of buildings for more visually interesting designs. In the Wasteland, you should expect to see a ton of improvised construction around. There's just so many different ways to go about buildings. So snapping is a extremely useful mechanic in creating structures, but I think players have an over-reliance on snapping and treat it as the end-all be-all mechanic that dictates their creative choices in workshop mode. So I want to get you into the mindset of not just relying on the snap mechanic, but also using group select for manual placing. Quick example, how settlers love to leave doors open? Instead of snapping, we can group select a door that's already open and manually place it back. So logically, when settlers try to open the door, they'll actually close it instead. And if we also open a barn wall, then we can treat it as a new wall texture for us to use. Murkwater has this wet, swampy marsh environment. So as an example of adaptive architecture, let's build a cabin based off of elevated shacks from the south. For the front of the shack, I manually placed a barred wall in the middle, which is hard to do with only snapping. Then I combined some smaller barn pieces together to shape up the front side. And notice how the collision between each piece wouldn't have been possible without group select. Then I placed the entire shack on top of scaffolding because I wanted to use a different kind of floor texture than the wood scaffolding ones. Notice how the rooftop, the front entrance, the elevated scaffolding, and the front porch roof can only be placed together using group select instead of snapping. This is a very simple structure and it's super easy to build once you get comfortable with the mindset that individual pieces can be moved around by you alone and, not by the whims of whether or not it can snap to another object. So with building structures, there's just so many different designs you can try, and you could really discover a lot of builds here on YouTube that you can replicate, and I could personally make a whole deep dive video on cool experimental designs you can work with, but for this video, I'll introduce a simple watchtower for you to replicate.
Old buttermilk sky, I'm keeping my eye peeled on you. What's the good word tonight? Are you gonna be mellow tonight? Old buttermilk sky, can't you see my little donkey and me? We're as happy as a Christmas tree, heading for the one I love. I'm gonna pop her the question, that question. Do you, darling, do you do? It'll be easy, so easy, if I can only bank on you. Old buttermilk sky, I'm telling you why, now you know. Keep it in mind tonight, keep a brushing those clouds from sight. Old buttermilk sky, don't you fail me when I'm needing you most. Hang a moon above her hitching post, hitch me to the one I love. You can if you try, don't tell me no lie. Will you be mellow and bright tonight, buttermilk sky?
The second style of structures is what I call Barnacle Building, or the idea of utilizing pre-existing structures the same way a Wastelander would. The advantage of Barnacle Buildings is that it tends to feel more natural looking because, you're literally working off the landscape of the settlement itself, and so you don't have to deal with the creative process of making an entire structure from the ground up. There are two levels with Barnacle Building. The first level is to just repair and modify the structure, laying out a new floor and replacing walls. Of course, coming back to the idea that group select allows you to manually place objects, we can use this to patch and repair buildings. And before we really go over the best practices of repairing, I'll briefly recap the campfire trick. Notice how there are floors that let you sink objects and there's floors that don't allow any sinking. This is where we use the campfire trick because more often than not, when it comes to repairing buildings, we are often working on unsinkable floors. The mechanic is that the campfire settlement object contains ground textures inside the model, so the trick is we can sink objects through the little pocket dimension inside, which makes it easy to maneuver group selection inside. For walls, generally I try to line up walls using stairs as a stairing object, and then I try to adjust it from the outside so I can sink it in. Patching or replacing floors requires adjustments with height, so I use the campfire to adjust the pillar. So my usual setup for ceilings is using a pillar for the steering object that's on top of a campfire to allow sinking. Then we use the height adjustment control to reach that desired sweet spot. Roofs are extremely hard to replace specifically because there's a certain amount of angles that we can make with workshop items. Ball track ramps provide the steepest angle, and there's plenty of settlement specific scenarios, so I'll go over the overall technique so you can apply the general outline wherever. I like to start off with setting up this marble foundation at roof height, placing stairs so you can reach up. Once you create your roof setup, group select it with a long conduit to a pillar. The foundation allows us to sink in the pillar to adjust our height, and the conduit gives us distance from the building to, reduce collision complication, and it also gives us a wider viewing angle. So the second level Barnacle Building is using pre-existing structures as a foundation or a jumping off point for new structures. My reasoning is that sometimes buildings by themselves maybe are, just kind of dull, but when combined together make a more dynamic and cohesive style of architecture. My sanctuary build highlights both aspects of Barnacle Building, where I repaired and cozied up the entire house, then ended up creating an entire second story on top of the house, which I used to connect to the other buildings, forming an entire city layout this way. Here at my Grey Garden build, in terms of stylistic choice in adaptive architecture, I converted the entire highway as a industrial style farm/factory that's, more physically secure. And in terms of Barnacle Building, I applied scaffolding and other structures to make each level of the highway accessible and, turn into one single cohesive looking plan. The basic idea here is that there are only a handful of furniture objects in the vanilla version of the game, and so if we utilize build techniques such as the rug glitch and group select plus a little bit of creativity, then we can craft some unique looking furniture for our builds, and it really helps break up the repetitive visuals that comes with vanilla builds. So first example here, this glass shelf can be combined with gun racks to make a interesting looking weapons display. To go a little further, I combined weapon racks with side-by-side grocery shelves to make a more professional gun display. You just have to experiment with the placement. This is to kind of introduce the idea that settlement objects don't have to be individual pieces. We can and should get used to combining them for more cohesive sets. Our second example shows off the rug glitch for this tool shed. So here we can see the rug glitch and the height drop mechanic at play, but in this specific case we can actually see the drop working in our favor, where it ends up looking more cohesive. Here we place two workbenches together with the metal cabinet to make one connecting station. With this example, the workbenches are at a perfect height, so I don't have to store the mats, and they're not noticeable anyways. And as you can see, the entire station is underneath a large mat, so we can actually move the station wherever we want. You can also experiment with the height of furniture objects by stacking mats on top of each other. I stacked mats here, so the terminal keyboard is just at the right height when I clip it into the desk. The other way to make creative furniture is with group select. The basic concept is that we can smush furniture objects with each other to make a new furniture piece. A really simple yet effective method is to just stack duplicate furniture objects on top of each other, which can be done effectively with the height adjustment tool within workshop mode. So when you group select, the objects can actually phase into each other almost seamlessly, which allows you to line them up perfectly. So first, hold the place button to enable group select, then line up the furniture pieces together, then press and hold the left bumper on controller to enable height adjustment. So here I just stacked small tables which now can be seen as a shelf to display items, and here I stacked dressers to make a mailbox. The general idea is to think about furniture as not only separate objects, but components for a larger set piece. Settlement building isn't intensive or a high concentration activity, so the single most important tip that I can actually give you is to put on some background audio while building so you can kill two birds with one stone in terms of leisure activity. It's something I already do in my everyday life for mundane activities such as doing laundry or dishes. For me, I tend to listen to educational podcasts and video essays on YouTube, but you can also listen to audiobooks, easygoing television episodes, stand-up comedy specials, or simply just music. Instead of hearing the same 20 voice lines, you can fill the auditory airspace with something more productive or engaging at least. Sometimes even the background audio can really help you get in the mood. So, for example, if you wanted to build something spooky, you could put on some old school radio horror dramas. Or perhaps you can try out today's sponsor. Sorry, I'm messing with you. But if this is something you already do, let me know in the comments what you've been listening to, because I'm always open to trying new things. Lived-in design is how you make the settlement itself feel like people actually inhabit the place, and you could get the impression that lived-in design could clash with the whole scrappy junkyard aesthetic, but there's an obvious balance with making the build seem naturally improvised, yet realistically livable. So just talking about overarching design here, I treat my layouts to be maybe not so much realistic because realism doesn't exist in Fallout, so let's just say reasonable layouts for settlements where, there's plenty of open paths and walkable spaces where, reasonably there wouldn't be any huge obstacles and heavy foot traffic. Here at my sanctuary build, I left the entire road completely free of objects, so I'm sacrificing quite a bit of potential building space just to give settlers the ability to traverse around. For me specifically, I love the feeling of the town being dense and crowded, yet at the same time wide open for travel, especially for caravans. For more practical reasons, keeping sensible open layouts helps settlers traverse around because it encourages movement and doesn't confuse settler pathing. In terms of actual living spaces, I like to have dedicated individual spots. Just in general, building up settlements doesn't have any real gameplay function, but even then, I still like to have specific dedicated areas that, don't serve any purpose other than making the build seem more livable. Spaces like armories, tool sheds, bathrooms, and individual shops. Obviously, for pure convenience, you can just plop down multiple beds next to each other, put all the shops into a single room, but, if it's a build that I want to put some effort on, then I'll take the time to create some narrative spaces. One exercise I want to introduce to you are cooking stations. Depending on the geography and theme of the settlement, cooking spaces could look completely different, and since there's multiple cooking stations, there's plenty of different ways you could go about it. Here at Sunshine Tidings, there's already a incomplete kitchen setup, so I opted to use the stove-style setup with plenty of space to store food because it's more of a communal kitchen. At Murkwater, I imagined the geography to be cold and damp, so I made an outdoor open pit setup so settlers can stay warm as well as heat up food. I think about how you go about creating living narrative spaces is an interesting mental exercise in and of itself. One underrated visual cue that I want to hone in on is storage. It just means that people will pack up and store things because realistically, any permanent living settlement will have a surplus of food or maybe keep around extra building supplies and just hold on to things in general. So try placing random containers lying around. It could be super organized and strategically placed or spread around sparsely. Gameplay wise, we can stuff like a ton of supplies in a single workbench, but it helps with the immersive aspect to have like large quantities of storage. Specifically in Wasteland interior design, I want to highlight miscellaneous containers. The ones with the yellow outlines that you can scrap in workshop mode. Realistically, people will have things lying around in open containers because it's easy to organize and to hold and carry around multiple items in, little bins and baskets. In a more practical sense, these little containers are just objects to help present your item decorations in a new context and, also serve as additional mundane decorations. The idea is to find them throughout the world map, grab and hold the object, then walk them back to the settlement, so it's kind of convenient to figure out some object hotspots. One example is in Lexington, which is a stone's toss away from Starlight Drive-In. In front of the Super Duper Mart, there's plenty of objects lying around, such as shopping carts, tricycles, and there's plenty of outdoor locations you can find these nifty little containers, but just to start you off with some hotspots around the beginning part of the map, Wicked Shipping has plenty of box crates and a wood basket. This unmarked spot south of Sanctuary has 3 wood baskets. There's 5 cardboard boxes at the Atomic General Galleria. In the middle of College Square are about a dozen plastic bins. There are multiple barrels next to Starlight Drive-In. Of course, it can be tedious to find these objects and bring them back and also resist the urge to scrap them, but personally they add a lot of character to a build because of the fact they're just mundane little containers and they help sell the lived-in aspect of settlers just collecting stuff and organizing them. On a related note, item decorations are one of the most common methods I use to create lived-in spaces, as well as adding so much variety and charm to my builds. To repeat information from the first video, we can either place workshop items by dropping them from our inventory, then moving them in workshop mode. Or we can manually grab items and move them using the trigger buttons to rotate, and pressing the left joystick to change the axis of rotation. To serve the Wasteland aesthetic, you can literally just drop down items and, start placing them willy-nilly, as variety and messy detail is more of the focus over organization. For lived-in design, it's reasonable for settlers to reuse old world objects, even if they have some wear and tear. So, for example, multiple canisters and jugs to hold resources, reusing old dishes, and just general ambient decor. The way you go around placing items can also reinforce the theme you may be going for in a specific build. For example, in Kiri's cabin, I focused on placing science and medical tech. With McCready's Watchtower, I imagined him to have a small arsenal, and at Hancock's cabin, there's plenty of chems and booze. A genuinely useful resource that I constantly use is the Independent Fallout Wiki. This site has a great article detailing all the items and where you can specifically find them, including fixed locations and vendors. They even have a whole dedicated visual catalog, so you can kind of decide which items you want to track down for your settlements. For the clean builders out there, You can raid the cabin house for shiny clean items, and the items inside the house respawn after one in-game week, so essentially you have an infinite amount of clean items to work with. I haven't experimented too much with the home bunker pack from the anniversary edition, but it seems like all the locations respawn with their clean items as well. The Vault Tech Showcase specifically brings a couple new items for us to use. Okay, so I totally get the frustration with dealing with physics where items seemingly disappear and move on their own. That's why the OC Decorator mod is so popular, but let's actually break down why your items move and what we can do to reduce the chances of that happening in vanilla. There's collision physics where obviously they get moved around by some force, and a lot of that just comes from NPCs teleporting and spawning directly on top of placed items. There's also gravity physics where items fall through furniture, and I'll just go over why that happens. So my main overall solution to gravity issues is item proofing. We item proof furniture by group selecting small rugs to go slightly underneath the surface of the furniture because rugs load in faster than any settlement object. Either we item proof when we directly create furniture and group select the entire setup, or we can just apply them when the objects are already in place with the help of the campfire trick. Generally, some furniture objects are safer to place, but it's kind of irrelevant since item proofing is by far the best solution to gravity issues. Placing items directly on the ground is a safe option to decorate because the landscape always loads in first. So we can use larger junk items such as gas cans for larger visible decoration. If you want safe indoor placements, you can place a rug that matches the color tone of the floor and then place items on top. If you're playing on the older gen console, indoor settlements such as Vault 88, Homeplate, and the Mechanist layer are great places to go all out on items because loading screens give time for all the objects to load in properly. With collision physics, where your items might get knocked around, there isn't an all-in-one solution, but there are best practices you can do to significantly reduce the chance of it happening. There's obvious preventable factors to be mindful of, such as furniture and hangout placements, because settlers will directly displace any items in their way, and can also reduce the amount of explosions in your settlements that might send items flying. What I like to do is place items against walls and corners because if the items do get pushed, they can only go a certain direction. My favorite kind of placement is with these big shelves. Shelves are a great way to keep items in place, and a good test for you is if you can't knock anything over by sprinting into the shelf, then chances are settlers can't either. With these multi-level shelves, settlers also can't teleport inside the same way they could do on top of tables, so that's an extra layer of security. The absolute ultimate setup to showcase your rare items is the glass display because you can item proof, which will reduce the gravity issues, and the enclosure will prevent any collision physics besides explosions, which, will still keep the items inside. Okay, so let's say you're a player who just doesn't care about using items at all. Like, you don't want to deal with any physics, and no, that's completely fair. So, I'll give you some items you can still decorate with. Car aisle typewriters are the semi-rare clean versions of the typewriter that have the unique property of being completely static, meaning it has hard collision and can float in the air. So when you move it around in workshop mode, you can literally just treat it as another workshop decoration. Deep in the island in the Far Harbor DLC, there's a burning ship adjacent to the Southwest Harbor, which contains the storage drives required for a certain quest. But what you may not know is that one of these drives completely respawn after 7 in-game days, so you can collect one per week. Besides having the static effect on them, they also have interesting looking textures that can be viewed in different ways depending on the context you place them in. Nearby is the Vim factory, and inside you can find a giant Vim bottle that you can keep for yourself. So that's going to do it for this video. I hope that explaining my general settlement building thoughts helps you think of your own design process and how you approach your next build. So for now, I don't really have a complete build for you today, but I'll leave you with a B-roll montage on my Sunshine and Burkwater builds as a way to recap the design concepts covered in this video, but I hope you enjoyed the content and happy holidays.
Who do you know in heaven that made you the angel you are? Who did you see, I wonder, that made you just the cutest little charmer by far? Where did you get those good looks, those eyes that glow like a star? It seems they made the sunshine only twice in your sweet smile and paradise. So tell me, won't you, darling, who do you know in heaven that made you the angel you are?
Who do you know in heaven, honey, that made you the angel you are? Who did you see, I wonder, that made you just the cutest little charmer by far? And where did you get those good looks, baby? Those eyes that glow just like a star.
It seems they made the sunshine only twice in your sweet smile and paradise. So tell me, won't you, darling, who do you know in heaven that made you the angel you are? Darling, won't you tell me, who do you know in heaven that made you the angel you are? since we have parted, I miss all your charms. I want to be near you, to hold you again in my arms. Why, oh why did we say goodbye? Please come back and let's give love another try. I wait for you, lover, 'cause I can't love another. What a wonderful world this will turn out to be. The sun's gonna shine on that day when you come back